Well, 2023 was yet another year of international crises. And this week, Power and Politics is digging into 5 geopolitical flashpoints to watch in 2024. Our coverage spans 4 continents, 2 wars, and a pivotal election that could define the international order for the next 4 years. This week, we've discussed the Middle East, India, the Russia-Ukraine war, and today, we're going to zero in on China. Asia's largest economy is an economic powerhouse with growing military might. At the beginning of 2023, relations between Beijing and Washington spiraled. Tensions approached pandemonium when the U.S. military shot down a Chinese spy balloon that had drifted over the continental United States. That episode led to the cancellation of high-level meetings and a prolonged absence of military-to-military talks. Now, relations began to thaw in November when U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping held formal talks in California. But tensions over Taiwan, China's military posture in the South China Sea, and technology embargoes continue to cast a shadow over that relationship. Vina Nadjibulla is Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Gordon Houlden is Director Emeritus of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. It's good to see you both. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you, David.
Vina, as we start 2024, I think really the West's relationship with China is really dependent on the state of the U.S.'s relationship with China. How would you describe that relationship right now?
Yes, as you mentioned in your opening, David, in the last few weeks, we've seen a de-escalation in tension between U.S. and China after the meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. We've seen a resumption in military-to-military dialogue. We've seen some cooperation on fentanyl from China's side. But it would be important to note that while the weather in the China-U.S. relations may have improved, the overall climate of the relationship is still very tense and the differences persist. And that is because U.S. and China are systemic rivals. They're engaged in strategic competition in every domain: military, political, ideological, diplomatic. And this desire to have stability and to de-escalate tension may face a lot of challenges in 2024 as we see elections in Taiwan, and depending on the outcome there, as well as we see tensions in South China Sea with Philippines and so forth. So yes, there's some stability now, but we'll see how long that will hold.
You know, Gordon, Vina touches on a very important point there. You know, relations have been strained, but no matter who's really in power in the United States, both the Republicans and the Democrats, they view China as the biggest strategic threat to the United States. So how does that influence this relationship going forward?
Well, absolutely. There's a bipartisan consensus in Washington and Congress and the country, quite frankly, that China is rival number one, potential enemy, military threat. Those are the common themes one hears every day out of Washington. However, and I think as Vina noted, there has been a realization, I believe, on both sides that how far do you run with these tensions? The risk of war is there, particularly perhaps related to either the South China Sea or Taiwan. And I think both sides are conscious of there's a downside risk. I think for Xi Jinping in China, the problems that Russia has run into in Ukraine will be somewhat of a warning. And for the United States, they are once again mightily distracted by what's happening in the Middle East and, of course, what's happening in the Ukraine-Russia war. So there are restraints to some extent on both sides, but the tensions are there, and they may worsen. They're across the board, economic, strategic, military. But there's also this break on both sides, holding them back, hopefully, from open conflict with unknowable consequences.
You know, Vina, a lot of focus, as Gordon says, on Ukraine, Russia, on what's happening with Israel and Hamas. Suddenly, in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, a lot of focus on Taiwan, right, where they have an election. And this is one of the other big flashpoints people are worried about. What's at stake there? What are you watching for on that front as Taiwan has an election this weekend?
Yes, this Saturday in Taiwan, we'll have a very consequential election, both presidential as well as legislative elections. And there are three parties contesting the elections. And of course, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and their candidates, the current vice president, has a slight lead in the polls. Of course, China sees a potential win by Lai Ching-te as a really bad development. They've made that very clear. They're essentially calling that would be a vote for war by people of Taiwan. And they're hopeful that the KMT, the main opposition party, that their candidate will win the election. So there's a lot at stake. And of course, depending on the outcome, we may see some aggressive Chinese behavior, both through the gray zone activities as well as coercive economic sanctions. So quite a few potential flashpoints in Taiwan in the next few weeks. And of course, but none of that means that the people of Taiwan should not have freedom to vote for the candidate that they want. So, and I think what we're noticing, I'm in Singapore at the moment, and I was in Taiwan earlier this week. There's quite a bit of calm and resilience among the population. They've lived with these kinds of China threats for a very, very long time. And I think it's encouraging to see how calm and resilient the population is in the face of these unprecedented threats and challenges from China.
So Gordon, people obviously watching that as China poses a potential security threat, but there's also the economic threat from China. And not that long ago, it seemed like their superpower status was inevitable. The economic growth was staggering and surging, but it's kind of leveled off. There are some signs of demographic weaknesses inside China. I mean, what should Canadians know about the strength and trajectory of the Chinese economy in 2024?
Well, like most complex things, the Chinese economy is certainly complex. There's two sides to this equation. There are three, in my view, principal weaknesses. One is the demographic challenge, as you pointed out. There aren't enough young Chinese. The labor force is beginning to shrink, and that will accelerate going forward. There's a considerable debt load, particularly at the municipal and local levels, where the government's been borrowing and investing heavily in fixed assets to keep the economy turning, but not necessarily the wisest approach. And there's also the risk of slowing global demand. China has not been successful at moving its economy as quickly as they wish to domestically generated consumption. However, for a couple decades, I've been listening to tales of the imminent collapse of the Chinese economy. Like most big economies, it has a lot of momentum forward. They did reasonably well managing the economic effects of COVID at great cost. As well, it's not as if the other major economies on Earth are not facing challenges. We in Canada and in the United States. So they have their sets of problems, but I think they are manageable, barring a sharp deterioration in the relations with the West, which would have a knock-on effect related to their market access, et cetera. But in general, I'd say they will manage, they will stumble through, they won't fall over.
Vina, we started this segment talking about the weather balloons and the spy balloons. And of course, foreign interference was always became the dominant issue here in Canada. And now we've got an inquiry that's about to begin, and we've got China's foreign minister. Now we're getting alerts saying in talks with Canadian counterpart Melanie Joly, Canada is open to contacts and dialogues. China is open to contacts and dialogues with Canada. The fundamental reason why China-Canada relations have fallen to a low point in recent years, according to Chinese foreign minister, is that there have been a serious deviation in Canada's perceptions of China. And China's foreign minister hopes the Canadian side will interpret China's domestic and foreign policies objectively, rationally, and correctly. How do you interpret that?
Yeah, so we've been seeing news out of China that Minister Joly and her counterpart Wang Yi had a conversation earlier today. I haven't seen a readout from the Canadian side, but the Chinese readout that you read is really quite interesting. So they basically are saying that the relations can improve if three conditions are met. And the first condition is that Canada has correct cognition. I mean, it's an interesting kind of thought control experiment that we ought to see the difficulties in the relationship as essentially stemming from a misperception of China and its intentions in the world, that China is not trying to undermine rules-based order, that China is not a disruptive power. So everything that was listed in Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, China essentially saying that we ought to correct that perception in order to be able to put the relations on a good footing. But I think what's important to note is that similar to other Western allies, U.S., Australia, the European allies, there is a desire on the part of Canada and certainly our government to have functional dialogue with the Chinese side. And the last phone conversation that Minister Jolie had with her counterpart was in April of 2022. So it's been quite a long time. And I think if there has in fact been a phone call, which I guess there was, it is a positive sign, and we do need to have functional dialogue. That doesn't mean that the relations are going to be normalized. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden Canada would have a different, quote unquote, perception of China and its role in the world, but we can have our differences. This is a complex relationship, and we still need to engage in functional dialogue because we also have an important trading relationship with China. Let's not forget that notwithstanding diplomatic tensions, in 2022, trade with China still increased, was quite robust, especially in certain sector, agri-food, commodities, energy sector, and that will continue, and that is okay. But we do need to recognize that the overall direction of travel with respect to engagement with China, including on the economic front, is one of de-risking and diversification, de-risking to other economies in Southeast Asia and diversifying our supply chains. So I think overall, it's good that there are high-level contacts, but let's be realistic in terms of the scope for improvement in the relationship.
Right. Yeah, so Gordon, on that point, just as a final point for this conversation, I mean, we have seen the government of Canada try to work with China on things such as climate, for example, the biodiversity summit they held very recently in Montreal. But, you know, we're about to have an inquiry into foreign interference, which is probably going to reveal a serious number of allegations that are not going to cast China necessarily in a kind light. We're close allies with the U.S. That great power rivalry still hangs over everything. Where do you see Canada-China relations going in the short to medium term?
Well, I actually think the Chinese foreign minister is right. The problem is perceptions of China and Canada. However, what he doesn't note is why are those perceptions so negative? And we know the reasons. Political interference, arbitrary arrest of individuals. These have soured the views of China within Canada, within the media, within the public, and within the politicians in Ottawa. That's not something you can turn around as quickly as we might have had recoveries in the past. But we are now, yes, trying to reestablish a dialogue, but we're far behind our G7 counterparts. Australians have had head of government meetings. The Americans have treasury secretaries and other cabinet members going to China. They have head of government meetings. The Brits, the Germans, the French have all done far better. But in the current environment, and with, as you note, an inquiry coming up, that's not the environment in the public that will assist a recovery.
I want to thank you both. I learn a lot about this stuff every time we speak. Vina Nadjibulla, Gordon Houlden, thank you so much for joining us today.